Good afternoon, everyone. It is 3:30, and we are ready to get started. Welcome to the second part of the session called Ecosystem-Based Management from a Pan-Arctic Perspective. We have 4 excellent talks lined up for you today, as well as a panel discussion. So, some housekeeping rules. We will have a keynote speaker. They will speak for 15 minutes, and we have 5 minutes for questions. And then we have 3 talks of 8 minutes each, and then 2 minutes each for questions. My name is Jane Haugen. I will be your moderator for the session as well as the panel. And with that, we are going to start with our first speaker. We have the keynote speaker. This is Øystein Leiknes from the Norwegian Environment Agency, and he will be speaking on integrated management plans for Norwegian sea areas, the interaction between politics, policy, and science. Welcome, Øystein.
Thank you. I've seen a lot of nice presentations today, and it's been a very impressive forum so far. And this presentation has been compiled together with Mette Skjern-Møritzen from the Institute of Marine Research, and Geir Klavenes and Fredrik Juel Theisen from the Ministry of Environment. The title of the talk is Integrated Management Plans for Norwegian Sea Areas, and the interaction between politics, policy, and science. As you will see through my talk, we sort of have 2 different levels when we are dealing with integrated management plans in the Norwegian sea areas. So we therefore collaborated for this talk to show how we work on the sort of more strictly scientific level and how that is transformed into politics. So in Norway we have had our first management plans was almost 20 years ago. The rationale for involving and starting a system with the integrated ocean management plans was various, but it came from at least the commitment to the Johannesburg Protocol from a UN meeting in 2002, calling for a more ecosystem approach to management of the sea. And we also saw that the different sectors had conflicts of interest and had interest for the same areas. And it was identified that there was a need for a framework that could integrate all the knowledge and also create a system to make some overall decisions. And it's also a way to open discussions, get political consensus, and also involve the people in getting more interest for the Norwegian sea areas. As you may or may not know, Norway is almost purely an ocean state. We have 2.3 billion square kilometers of sea, whereas only 385,000 square kilometers of land. And some of our main export is from oil and gas industry, agriculture and fisheries that are also connected to the sea. And increasingly also the tourism is more and more important, as you may have seen during the days here in Tromsø. We have 3 management areas: the Barents Sea, the Lofoten, Norwegian Sea, the North Sea, and the Skagerrak, that you can see in this picture. The Norwegian management plans, they have 2 main objectives. One is to promote value creation through sustainable use of marine resources, and at the same time contribute to maintain ecosystem structure, functionality, productivity, and biodiversity. So the overall aim then is to have a clarified overall framework and to increase cooperation and clear priorities in the ocean management. And it's also a way for the industry to get increased predictability, and this will then again facilitate coexistence between ocean industries and activities. The system is set up like this. We have an interministerial steering committee, which is led by the Ministry of Climate and Environment. For those who are in the back of the room, you'll probably not see all the names, but it's all the ministries that have something to do with the sea. So they are giving a mandate to 2 advisory groups. The one group is the advisory group on monitoring, which is headed by the Institute of Marine Research, headed by Mette Skjerm-Mauritzen, who is present here today. And the other one is the Forum for Integrated Ocean Management, which at the moment I am leading. For the Forum for Integrated Ocean Management consists of all the directorates that are involved in the sea and the sea activities. And the monitoring group is more focusing on have a good description of the state of the ocean, but they also involve some of the directorates, like the Directorate of Fisheries. And that is because we need to develop an indicator set that also includes indicators that says something about the impact from human activities. So these 2 advisory groups are then responsible for compiling the scientific base that the politicians use when they are making decisions and putting their knowledge base into use through the marine management plans. An important part of the marine management plan system is what we call the identification of particularly vulnerable areas. They are selected by evaluating their different environmental values, and we're using the EBSA areas from the EBSA criteria from the CBD in this process. So this is something that is adaptive, and we have to adjust it whenever, for instance, the marginal ice zone is moving, or when important spawning growths are moving. So this is important to have an update to set frames for different activities. When we did this identification of particularly valuable and vulnerable areas, these were then identified based on 7 ecosystem components: ice biota, plankton, fish, mesopelagic fauna, benthic fauna, seabirds, and marine mammals. The areas are of particular importance to marine life. We often call them the engines of the ecosystem. And this means that those areas are not just important by themselves, but they're also fueling the whole ecosystem. If you are destroying an important spawning ground, this will also impact the rest of the areas that are not a part of EBSA areas, or the particularly vulnerable and vulnerable areas. This map shows the 19 areas identified through the last process of combining the scientific base. And it is 55% of the total management plan area. We also had a talk on how we do the overall assessment of ecological state previously today by Per Arnberg. I just wanted to highlight the same main conclusions. For this period, the last 4 years, we have been working with compiling the scientific base for the marine management plans. We did a new framework for assessing ecological state based on a reference state, which we call intact nature. That's nature that is not substantially impacted by human activities. So whenever we see a change in the nature from this reference state, we can say that we see a change from the intact nature state. As you can see from this figure, we decided to divide the Barents Sea into the subarctic and Arctic areas. And we had a separate assessment for Norwegian Sea and the North Sea and Skagerrak. Overall, we can say that the North Sea is the most heavily impacted of our sea areas. This is a sea area that is impacted both by climate change, fisheries, and also we see that this then affects the zooplankton dynamics, the trophic structure in the sea area, and this has impacted the seabird populations quite heavily. For the remaining sea areas, we detected either limited change or no change. But there's a big caveat to these investigations because we have looked into the different biological components in the system. And for most of the biological components that we have assessed, we only have time series that started around the year 2000, which means that we expect that with increasing climate change, we will see a substantial change also in the Arctic and subarctic ecosystems. Through the collaboration that we have in the management forum, we have also decided to develop a map solution where we can bring all the relevant information from the different activities into one map, which is called Arealverktøyet. And that helps us to plan new activities. It helps us to bring all the information needed together in one solution. Another part that is important for ecosystem-based management is to have a good evaluation of cumulative effects assessment. For the last period, we tried to use something called the ODEM as a framework for evaluating the cumulative effects. And we see from this figure that there is a huge variety of activities that goes into the different valuable and vulnerable areas. As you can see from the activity map, the North Sea and the Skagerrak is the area with the most human activities, but also a lot of activity in parts of the Barents Sea. Another important thing about ecosystem-based management is that it is adaptive and knowledge-driven. So since we have been doing this for 20 years now, we started by pulling together what we had of information to create a common knowledge base from the advisory groups. That's meaning information from state of the environment, sector-specific activities, evaluation and progress towards the environmental goals that were set up. And this has then been the basis for updating and integrating this information. And then this management plan is implemented through sector-specific measures where you prioritize knowledge production and tools development, amongst other things. And then you start a new cycle. Since we have this cycle every 4 years, we have to prioritize quite hard what we focus on for each year. So we sometimes focus extra on knowledge creation, sometimes we focus extra on tool development, and we identify knowledge needs from each cycle. And through this work, this is an example of how we are compiling all the necessary information together in one document. And through this work, we have we come into what we call the science policy interface. We see that there is a huge work to be done when you go from research, from basic research to applied research to knowledge needed to make good decisions. And it's very important when we do this that we have a wide participation both from the government level, in the advisor groups, in the scientific panels, and we also want to involve the stakeholders throughout the whole system. So we have meetings on a permanent basis. So each time we are starting up a new cycle with compiling the scientific base. We are inviting all the stakeholders for meetings. And we also have open consultation of the knowledge base that we are putting out on a public hearing. Although we have been working for this for a long time, we see that there are a lot of processes and roles in the knowledge production that is still difficult to address. And that is the sort of the duality that you need the knowledge to be independent from a strictly scientific point of view, but you still need it to be relevant for the sectors to use for other processes. We also see that we need to strengthen the link between the assessment and the marine management goals, so that we are sure that we are reaching the goals that are set up in the marine management plans. And also, we need to decide and discuss how we go from scientific reports and scientific panels to what goes as an advice from the advisory groups. And one thing is also that we have consensus, no consensus, and transparency on who is doing what and who is meaning what. I'm running out of time, but this is the last slide. So what we can say from 20 years of experience in Norway, it's important to have a long-standing dialogue and relationship across science, management, and policy. It's a capacity-demanding process, but it creates a solid and legitimate knowledge base that can be used in other cross-sector processes. And it's important to have patience and flexibility and see that many decisions that the politicians made are compromises where they balance the use and the protection. So with that, I think I'll end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Øystein. What a great start to the session. Do we have one quick question? Yes, we have a question in the back.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about using a reference state used for the assessment of ecological states, I was wondering if you could share any more details about that. Is the reference state using data from 20 years ago? Is it based on a model? Is it based on like a compilation of different data that's been collected? I was just wondering more about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not my expertise to say in detail what we call the reference state, but the whole idea is that we have the reference state is what we know as the state a functional group would be in if it wasn't impacted significantly by human activities. So for many of the biological components, we don't have this information, since this is, for instance, whaling that was going on already in the 15th, 16th century, etc. But we do have models, and we do have some baseline data on things like climatology and hydrography, and we have some data series on important fish species that dates back 100 years or so. So at least we have some data that dates back to pre-industrial fishing era. So I think that will be the short answer to that question. I can share some references to the panel method that has been used.
Thank you so much, Øystein. Øystein will also be in our panel discussion later, so there will be more opportunities to ask him questions. We have two speakers for the next talk. We are lucky. We have Abby Tingstad and Amelia Campbell from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. They will be speaking on Can the Antarctic offer lessons to the Arctic for ocean management? Welcome.
All All right, thank you so much for providing us with the opportunity to speak today, and we're looking forward to some discussions. As you heard, my name is Abby Tingstad. I am a researcher at RAND and also a visiting professor of Arctic research at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy.
And I'm Amelia Campbell. I'm a student at the Coast Guard Academy in my final year of study of undergrad in the government major. And this reflects part of the senior research project that I'm doing with Dr. Tingstad and two other classmates.
So let's take a trip to the other pole, and it will be a brief one because we're now under 8 minutes, but we'll get there quickly and come back. And let me give just a little bit more of an explanation of where this research came about. So we're conducting this research within the agenda for the Center for Arctic and Antarctic Study and Policy at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. We are the U.S. Coast Guard's one and only think tank, and the Coast Guard, as you may know, has a mission set involving living marine resources. Like everyone else, and we've been talking about a lot already during this conference, there's a need to plan and to strategize for the future. So one of the big question areas that we've been hearing about has been what's going to happen with the Central Arctic Ocean. I think we'd all like to know with some certainty into the future. And although we can't provide that crystal ball, what we have been looking at is what kinds of lessons might we learn from other areas of the world, and in particular, we've looked at the Antarctic, but as you'll see momentarily, our research is a little bit broader than that. So what we have done in this research, and I should emphasize that we are not ecological scientists. We're, as Amelia mentioned, she's a government major, and I'm a bit more of a organizational scientist at this point than anything else. And so what we decided to look at was, as you may be aware, there are almost 24 regional fisheries management organizations around the world. These are international organizations that help produce binding management measures for different fisheries where there's either highly migratory species or species that cross a lot of different boundaries, beyond borders, right? The theme of this conference. And so some of these have been in operation for decades, so we might be able to learn something about their business rules and how they've been conducting successfully and perhaps in some cases unsuccessfully negotiations for different measures to produce sustainable and manage sustainable fisheries as well as conservation areas. So really our two questions that we've been looking at since this fall have been which of these regional fisheries management organizations might be most appropriate to draw lessons from for either current Central Arctic Ocean fisheries agreement negotiations and discussions, or perhaps something different in the further future for that area, and then also to start to draw some lessons as available from different regional fisheries management organizations. And we've started by looking at CAMLR, which of course involves the Southern Ocean. So our research is really in its initial phase, or we've just completed, I should say, the initial phase. We're about halfway through. And so what we'll talk a little bit about today is some of the comparisons that we've been looking at across regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs. And then Amelia will present a little bit of the work that she's been done, taking a much deeper dive, looking at the southern pole, or rather the Southern Ocean near that pole. So we've managed to get through about just over half of the regional fisheries management organizations that exist. We first developed a concept for comparing various characteristics and attributes of them, again, for the purposes of asking the question, which ones might be most comparable in different ways to the Central Arctic Ocean situation now, or maybe in the near-term future. So we've been looking at aspects such as membership, which countries or other entities or organizations are involved. And what we found so far is that quite a few of the RFMOs have a significant overlap with at least the signatories of the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. We've been looking at various timelines and key dates. I'll pause on that because Amelia will actually show you an example of a detailed timeline that she's put together for the purposes of understanding what negotiations they undertake and how long those took and what some of the outcomes were. We, of course, have been looking at scope. One of the interesting things about these RFMOs is that they exist all over the world, and some exist for species that are so migratory there isn't precisely a geographic area, but rather thinking more about a particular species. We've looked at different types of measures each one has employed over different timelines. One of the aspects, being more students of organizations, if you will, has been really looking at the the amount of resources and what types, if they have any formally, these RFMOs have and how they employ it for science and other things. And Amelia will also speak a little bit about that. So thus far, by looking across these RFMOs, we have found, not surprisingly, that there is not a single RFMO that looks exactly like the situation in the Central Arctic Ocean, whether if we consider that to be the current agreement or moratorium that's in place, or something that might look like a different form of management in the future. That doesn't mean that we should throw this research out the window, certainly, and this was not a particular surprise, but rather we just want to acknowledge some of the key differences, two of which are as follows. One, all of the other RFMOs, at least as far as we can surmise at this point, have a assumption that there's some sort of fishing that is going on there, but that's not true currently for the Central Arctic Ocean. So that's a key difference from a policy perspective that must be considered. And of course, indigenous people, and especially the Inuit that have been very central in negotiations with the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, that is quite a unique feature that's really important. However, we do have some case studies that we are undertaking, the first that Amelia will speak about, CAMLR, and that we'll also expect that we will soon be looking at the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission as well. Over to you.
So as Dr. Tingstead mentioned, the first case study we chose to do was on CAMLR. We selected this case because of its broad similarity with CAOFA in the Central Arctic Ocean, including membership, the polar operational environment, and other key factors that we mentioned earlier. So the objective of our case study was to gain some insights from the successes and challenges that CAMLR has faced over its lifespan, to gain some insight to inform potential future CAOFA negotiations. And to do this, we did a three-part study, beginning with a comparison table of the various key factors and characteristics of each agreement, and then we did a timeline documentation to gain a broader understanding of CAMLR and the different phases it has gone through. And then finally, we did literature review and artifact gathering to map out some more specifics of the negotiations regarding fisheries. So this is an example of the timeline that we were discussing. We see it lasts a very long time, as CAMLR has been in existence for a while. The beginning shows the establishment period of CAMLR and some of those key documents that existed before CAMLR and after. And then the second part of the timeline goes into a few key negotiations that have occurred. So we see that some of the decisions take 5 years and some took over the course of several decades, which we noted as an asset to CAMLR in that there is the ability to reach consensus, but also potentially as a challenge when looking to apply it to CAOFA, because it does have extended timelines in some cases. We also were able to identify a connection between resourcing and funding with science and data and decision making. So we found that in CAMLR, the different sources of funding and resourcing, such as monetary contributions, private sector work, and in-kind contributions from military assets and things of that nature, having that reliable resourcing contributed to having consistent science and data that the scientific committee is able to use to inform decision makers of the commission, and then in turn those decision makers can allocate resourcing as needed to make their future decisions. So it's this cycle that we're continuing to investigate as we look to apply it to CAOFA.
So just ending on some initial research observations before we go to our next steps. So we definitely see some models of RFMOs emerging. This isn't surprising because several of the newer RFMOs have a membership overlap with some of the more historical ones, and you can see some models emerging. I would say the two biggest ones that we've seen is that there's a clear difference between those RFMOs that have a strong set of consensus-based business rules, definitions for things like scientific or research-based fishing, and then importantly, as Amelia just mentioned, that there's sort of a regular stream or ability to commit funds, whether those be actual funding to a central pot of money that's then distributed in a certain way, or something we would call in kind, like contributing a certain part of the whatever nation's scientific research budget to those topics that are of relevance. So there's that kind of a model versus those that are a bit more informal, we can put it that way. So we think that there are some useful lessons that can be learned from the existing RFMOs, but as I mentioned earlier, some clear differences from what we see there and what the situation is in the Central Arctic Ocean. So we advise some caution to be taken there. Just as a reminder of some of the successes that CAMLR might be resting on in terms of its business practices. There is that overarching architecture of the Antarctic Treaty System, and we think we've seen some benefit for the durability of CAMLR and the ultimate success of some of the negotiations, which, even though they did take some time, there's a con to that, but there's also a pro in terms of when you have that time, you can do some trial and error, you can kind of wait for various circumstances to change, in which case consensus might be easier to build. So just kind of an interesting note on timeline there. There is definitely, maybe never enough, but definitely some committed resources for CAMLR operations. And then, historical track record of operating despite difficult circumstances elsewhere in the world. With that, I will turn it back over to Amelia for some next steps. If I can advance the slide. There we go.
Our next step will be to finish up the RFMO comparison and the CAMLR case study by February, and then we'll be doing 3 additional case studies on other RFMOs. And then by April, we hope to be synthesizing our conclusions to be ready to present those to the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters and also at the Coast Guard Academy's Research and Symposium Day in May.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abby and Amelia. Do we have one quick question from the audience? Oh, we have multiple. I saw that hand first.
Hey, thanks for this presentation. I'm working mostly in the Southern Ocean, and what I think is unique and special about the Antarctic Treaty System is that it, of course, operates with consensus. It's not a voting-based system. And I see some really big pros and cons in that, and I'm wondering what you all think.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. Sir?
I think the biggest pro and con is what we discussed throughout the presentation of the timeline that the consensus building can take. So that's the particular focus that I've had in looking into the consensus building aspect of it. Yeah, do you have anything?
Yeah, and I guess just alongside that, the obvious amount of resources it sometimes takes, both maybe financially, but also diplomatically, to kind of get everybody on board. But I'd love to talk with you more afterwards about what you see being a researcher in that area.
Would you recommend that moving forward? Like, would you recommend consensus-based system in the Arctic?
Well, given how other organizations in the Arctic work, like the Arctic Council, which is very collaborative, I think we're not ready to recommend anything, but we would certainly think that it would be in keeping with the Arctic governance for it to at least be collaborative. And then we can talk about what consensus-based versus collaboration means. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Abby and Amelia.
Okay.
And Abby will be in our panel, so there will be more opportunities to ask her questions. But now we're going to stay on schedule. We have our third speaker for this session. This is Justin Langen from the University of Manitoba. He will speak on integrating indigenous knowledge and community-driven approaches in EBM in the Arctic. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. There we go. Oh, that's the end. Pretend you didn't see that. So yeah, okay. Tanche, my name's Justin Langen. So yeah, I come from the rural community of Swan River, Manitoba, Canada. It's like smack dab in the middle of Canada. Outside of the University of Manitoba, I'm a parliamentary intern, but I'm also like an Indigenous youth activist. So I wanted to focus on something slightly different, mostly within the Indigenous communities, because I think what you'll see here is that, and what you have been seeing is that The nature of the Arctic and indigenous communities are symbiotic. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. So strengthening the EBM in the Arctic. I think when we hear a lot of statistics and numbers, it's sometimes difficult to ensure that indigenous communities are not only understood but also interacted with and approached in a free, prior, and informed consent manner that supports whatever research and study you're doing. So there we go. So yeah, I don't think I need to say how the Arctic is changing. I think we are all very much aware of how the temperature is rising, but a lot of the times we are finding solutions for a lot of the problems within science, and much of the time I feel like a lot of the solutions can come from the communities themselves. There's a new pressing need for a relationship between man and nature. But I've been noticing from my work as an advocate and being in various indigenous communities around the world that a lot of the solutions can be found within these indigenous communities. So when we talk about ecosystem-based management, that's a term that's relatively new to me because when I'm in these communities, it was readily apparent to me how EBM was within these communities prior to an understanding of it. It's something where once you learn more about these indigenous communities and about indigenous knowledge, it becomes quite clear. You see it as a complementary resource. It's rooted in indigenous people's affection and relationship for the land. It offers a unique perspective, and a perspective I think that oftentimes goes unchallenged and also unseen, and is something that is worth not just looking at, but integrating into research. It allows indigenous communities to understand environmental changes, to track migratory patterns of species, and understand the inherent interconnectedness of all species. And when we integrate that with scientific data, indigenous knowledge has been seen to enrich understanding, to enrich communities, and also broaden the understanding of the Arctic and the natural world. And we look at it here, it's somewhat of a, within indigenous communities, we look at the symbiosis of indigenous knowledge and principles and resources. So we look at the relationships of the land and how, that is interconnected with the principles of interconnectedness, of ensuring that indigenous communities and the animals and the plants are a part of this unified whole. And when we talk about indigenous knowledge, I think it's important to approach that in a distinctions-based approach, and understanding that traditional ecological knowledge can be integrated in a lot of the modern aspects that we're seeing. And when we look at stewardship practices, I think a lot of the traditional practices that we have been seeing, not just with the Inuit, but with the Sami peoples, is, something worth approaching, not at a purely scientific level, but at a community level. I think it's about humanizing a lot of the data and a lot of the research when we look at wanting to maintain the structure of the Arctic. And I think, from Canada, the Guayhanas National Park Reserve in British Columbia is, one such partnership that I think was quite valuable and is a powerful example. This was a heritage site with the Haida peoples of Canada. It integrated traditional ecological knowledge with the scientific research, with support of the federal government, that is, monitoring wildlife, managing resource extraction as well, and ensuring that both the needs of the environmental and the community are met. There's that partnership and that relationship that was there as well. It's more than just ecological benefits, however. They also contribute to the social, cultural, and the economic well-being of Indigenous peoples. when you empower Indigenous peoples as decision makers, there's a sense of ownership and pride in the stewardship of the land and the natural resources. So it is in this integration that we see that cultural knowledge of these communities is preserved for future generations, but it's also preserved within a lot of the data and a lot of the partnerships. So this was a sort of 4-quadrant relationship between the government, between scientists, between the communities, and also between, the natural resources sector, and sectors that, not always get along, but, we've seen such an example here. And a lot of the benefits and impacts of this, I think, are very tangible, because we see not only that it strengthens biodiversity conservation, but it also improves sustainable resource management. It enhances community resilience to environmental change. And this isn't wholly just, a one singular example. In my experiences with interacting with not just Indigenous youth, but Indigenous communities within the Arctic and outside the Arctic, many communities have such practices like monitoring wildlife and managing resource extraction. It benefits the communities, it empowers Indigenous communities, and preserves cultural knowledge. And it also promotes a holistic, effective approaches to climate change and industrial pressures. And it's these pressures, I think, that a lot of the times Indigenous communities are only consulted once. They're, not as, when I talk about free, prior, and informed consent, I think there has to be a relationship with these Indigenous communities, especially when you're doing research studies, when you're searching for scientific data. I think once again, we want to humanize that data. And when we look into the future directions of inclusive policy, I think to create actual meaningful change, we have to, recognize and respect and identify the Indigenous sovereignty and governance over Arctic lands and waters. The current governance structures often exclude Indigenous communities, but this must change. By working together, Indigenous peoples, scientists, and policymakers, we can co-develop management strategies that respect traditional knowledge while addressing contemporary challenges like climate change, pollution, and industrial pressures. Now, these collaborative approaches will not only strengthen the ecological outcomes, but also empower Indigenous communities and peoples to continue their roles as stewards of the land. Now, as we look into the future, I do want to say that, when we talk about the Arctic, we must also talk about Indigenous peoples in a way that respects their sovereignty and ensures that they're key to performing a resilient and sustainable Arctic environment. So merci for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Justin? We do, all the way in the back corner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Two quick questions that hopefully are interrelated. So one, within Indigenous communities, you get, like in the States, for example, where I'm from, you got tribal governments and you got people who live subsistence. Very different ideas of how to go about with development, life, the dynamics of the natural world and people. And second is, in the issue of sovereignty, I mean, in the nation sense, not so much domestic dependent nations, but nations, how is that, or might that evolve or move forward in the sense of being equals at a table, so the priorities are equally discussed by Indigenous tribal interests, whether it's subsistence or development, and the government in question? Thank you.
Of course, yes, thank you. No, it's a great question, a great understanding that when anyone is in government, or if you're working within science and research, I think it's always important to not just see Indigenous peoples as an umbrella, but to approach in a distinction approach. And that's, when you're talking about US based, tribal councils, it's important, I think, to not only go to a lot of the governmental leaders within the band, but also go to the community themselves and speak to community leaders. And when approaching Indigenous peoples within Canada, we have we have a lot of work to do, but there is a very modern approaches, I think, to putting Indigenous peoples within the table and I think much more in a consultation role, but also in a role that respects their sovereignty. And that, we've seen within Western Canada when, the natural resource sector wants to implement pipelines. We have seen a lot of pushback and a more, sense of free, prior, and informed consent. So I think, as I said, a distinctions-based approach, but also not only approaching the governmental leadership, but approaching the communities, because I think a lot of the solutions lie within the communities themselves, and it's that initiative that people must take to actively go to those communities and not just the elected leadership. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Justin will be on our panel, so there will be more opportunities to ask him questions. But we have one final speaker of this session, and that is Yara Nivenhuis from the Arctic University of Norway. She will be speaking on transboundary EBM and the restoration in times of geopolitical tensions in the Arctic. Welcome, Yara.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's great to see so many people in this room, even some familiar faces. So today I'll be talking about transboundary ecosystem-based management and restoration in times of geopolitical tension in the Arctic. So that's quite a title. So to illustrate this issue, I'm going to be using Pasvik as a case. It's a case that I work with on a daily basis and what I'm also writing my master's about. So a short introduction to the area. When we speak of Pasvik, we often speak about the Pasvik River as well. It's quite a large river that originates from the Inari Lake in Finland and then also partially serves as a border between Norway and Russia. So despite alongside the river, there's also multiple nature conservation areas, both in Finland, Norway, and Russia. As there's many important marshlands for birds, and there's quite a rich biodiversity, both in and outside of the rivers. So, when we speak about Pasvik, in Norway it's quite infamously known about how many human pressures there are to the ecosystem. One of which being pollution, mostly coming from a long-term nickel industry on the Russian side that has been active for almost 80 years and has been closed quite recently in 2020. Along the river, there's also 7 hydropower dams, which of course impacts quite a lot of the ecosystem there, especially migrating fish such as salmonids, like the brown trout. There's of course local fishery done by the local community. There's an increase in tourism, and we also have invasive species, vendans, which is a fish species that came from Finland, and of course the big issue of climate change. So we learn a lot about understanding the cumulative effects of these pressures. In science, nothing really exists in a vacuum, so we can't simply look at one pressure and try and calculate the effects. We have to look at the multiple effects, and Pasvik makes a really good case study for that also in the CLEAN project. So to be able to really understand the consequences, we need a very thorough understanding of the ecosystem. So that means what kind of species do we have in this ecosystem, how are the food webs, and how are different species affected by different pressures. For example, some fish, like as I mentioned before, the brown trout, is quite heavily affected by hydropower, while perch, for example, might not be as affected. And you have, one thing is the direct consequences, which of course blocking the migration ways, but you also have secondary or indirect effects, which is often through mitigation efforts. There's now a current issue on genetic diversity, for example, because of the hydropower trying to mitigate the decline in the species and therefore releasing a lot of brown trout, and then the genetic diversity gets worse. And on top of all this, we also need to take into account the changing of the climate. And we've basically known that the climate, the rising temperatures, but also changing in snowfall, ice melting, impacts almost every part of the ecosystem. So, transboundary environmental cooperation. As I mentioned before, Pasvik the ecosystem is located in 3 different countries, one of which being Russia. And what we've really learned of almost 30 years of quite effective cooperation, also with Russia in the past, is that communication really is key. And this is on many different levels. So it's important to communicate well between the stakeholders. Pasvik, although it's a small area, has a lot of different stakeholders. You have the hydropower companies, for example. We have scientific institutes located there. We also have scientific institutes that are there regularly to conduct research. UIT, for example, is very much involved. There's also an importance of communicating with the locals, and that means the local people living there, the indigenous people living there, that know a lot about the area, that have been living there way before we were even researching it. And that communication sort of goes both ways. So we can learn a lot about the ecosystem from them, but we can also learn what kind of information can we cooperate with and what can we find out. The locals, of course, are very concerned about the pollution in the area. So helping find out how bad is the pollution situation? Is it getting better now that the factory closed? What fish are safe to eat and consume? And are the mushrooms and the berries in the area safe to consume, for example? And there's also an increased importance in the communication between management and science. And that means that it's very useful for scientists to know what kind of information is lacking in management, how can we do research to contribute to managing the environment, but also the other way around. Management is very useful to know what kind of new discoveries do we have, especially now that there's a lot more research coming to climate change, adaptive management becomes increasingly important. And then, of course, since this area especially is transboundary, between countries, the communication is also incredibly important. And that means trying to understand each other's priorities. What would we like to find out? What kind of management has been practiced in the different countries before? So, of course, February 2022, an indefinite pause of contact between Norwegian and Russian officials. So everything that is government-owned or government-steered from Norway is no longer in contact with Russian officials. So this also meant that the work from the county governor of Troms and Finnmark, quite a long-term environmental cooperation, almost 30 years long, has also been held to a pause. And this means another challenging area for transboundary research and management. So, what's going on now? Luckily, there remains a very strong and efficient environmental cooperation with Finland, also Sweden and Norway, also in the Pasvik area. And there's a continued strong dialogue within Norway where it's possible, and also with Finland. The county governor, for example, has a yearly Pasvik seminar where also the local people and local institutions come together and they discuss like what new findings they have in the area and also what the local concernings are around the ecosystem. And in addition to that, there's quite a lot of multiple important scientific projects in the area, CLEAN being one of them, but also Interreg Aurora, our precious water, does a lot of monitoring, management-related monitoring from the county governor. UIT's long-term series that has been active for multiple decades, NIBIO, the institute that is locally there, and many more. There's also this multi-use plan that was meant to be a sort of plan for lasting into 2030 on how Russia and Norway were supposed to manage the area together with Finland. Of course, right after it was finished, the contact broke and we can't completely follow it through the way it was intended. But there is quite a lot of useful information from there. There's been a lot of mitigation and conversation about what's important to the different areas. And we can sort of still try and follow the structure of this as much as it's possible. So the way forward, it's hard to do, but we have to sort of remain positive. We've been in difficult climates before, especially with Russia. But both countries and both communities will realize that a healthy ecosystem is in the best interest for everyone, for both countries, no matter what. And that interest and passion for nature unites. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Yara. We have time for questions. We have one in the front here, yes. Do we have a microphone?
So thank you for a wonderful presentation here, taking up so many important aspects of this area at the same time. Then I want to challenge you a little bit because I want to see what you put in your terminology, stakeholders. You mentioned indigenous people being there from before starting investigating this area here. So why are you calling them stakeholders, you know, equal to industry, human activities, and all these things?
It's probably my own terminology, as you mentioned, but with stakeholders, I basically mean anyone that has an interest in the area and wants the best for the area, and basically plays a part in the area. So that can, of course, be the local community that lives there, but also companies have their interest and their place in the area. So it's basically anyone that is involved in Pasvik and is interested and is benefits from a healthy ecosystem in that matter.
But do you agree that everyone is a stakeholder, even science?
Yeah, science is also a stakeholder. Of course, we also have interest in finding out new methods and new changes in the climate and how it impacts. So also the scientific institutions absolutely belong to the stakeholders in the area.
Is there another question? Yes, there is.
I was just wondering, you mentioned that the plan that you showed at the end, at your last slide, is no longer involving Russia, but is there any communication, sharing of information about species that are crossing the boundary, for example, in Pasvik Reserve? Anything going on with Russia?
Since a lot of the management, or basically all of the management, also the Pasvik natural protected reserves, are government owned and steered. So that means that we don't have contact with the Russian side anymore, which, as you can imagine, does implicate quite a lot of complications. However, scientists, individual scientists, are still allowed to communicate. But of course, a lot of institutions are also government funded and owned, so that makes it a bit difficult.
Okay, let's have one more question. I think there's a question in the front here.
Gunnar Sander from NIVA. A question about management. You didn't mention the Water Framework Directive and Vannforskriften, the work undergoing based on that. That is the closest we are to ecosystem-based management in fresh water. Can you tell a little about what role that plays in the Pasvik?
I know for management, for sure, there's a lot in the directive, which is, you know, the central thing when it comes to water management. So there's a lot of rules there, or a lot of plans on how often we measure the waters, what the parameters should be, for example. So that's a very good guideline for us to know, okay, in this time we need to research the plant biodiversity every second year, for example. So that's, of course, very important in how science contributes and how we can also cooperate on finding these data.
Thank you so much, Yara. That was the final speaker of the session. We are now going to set up some chairs and get ready for the panel discussion. That means you in the audience have about 60 seconds to chat among yourselves, and then we would require your attention again. One more, yes. I'm going to introduce you, so yeah. I'm not sitting. We're good. All right. I didn't really time that, but I'm going to say that that was 60 seconds, and we are going to get started with our highly anticipated panel discussion. In this panel, we're going to cover important topics in ecosystem-based management, such as collaboration, governance, and knowledge integration. We have some wonderful experts on stage with us. I'm going to ask some questions for the panelists, but we want this to be interactive. So audience, please raise your hands when you have a question. We have microphones. Not yet. I know you have a question. Yeah, so when you get the microphone, state your name and your affiliation, and then who you are directing your question to. So let's welcome our panelists. We have a wonderful selection of people here today. You have heard from them all from this session or from the previous session today. We have Øystein Leknes, we have Yaran Juvenaus, we have Saskia Trubak, we have Justin Langen, and we have Abby Tingstad. So to get started, it would be great if you could all just say your name, your affiliation, and then a couple sentences about your work. So let's start with Øystein to my right.
Yeah, my name is Øystein Leknes. I work at the Norwegian Environment Agency. It's an agency under the Ministry of Climate and Environment. I chair a section with 15 employees, and we are working on marine management plans, but also marine restoration, alien marine species, marine protected areas, yeah, various topics that are covered by my section. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do from a day-to-day basis. And I also lead the Management Forum, which is one of two advisory groups for the Norwegian marine management plans. So it's I don't have many hobbies.
This is a hobby, come on. Yara.
So my name is Jaren Nieuwenhuis. I am on my last year as a master's student in freshwater ecology at UIT, where I'm writing about the Pacific cases I mentioned, and then specifically mercury exposure in perch, and also how water regulation and climate change add to that. And I'm also soon finishing off my first year as a political science master's student also at UIT.
Impressive.
Yeah.
Yes, so my name is Saskia Trubach, and I'm a policy science researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. So I think more broadly, I'm working on the topic of ecosystem-based management, both in the marine areas when it comes to marine conservation, but we also have a lot of projects about more the coastal areas, especially Norway, because in the south of Norway, there's also a lot of ecological problems that we're working on. So it's really like this integrated and how you can manage land sea as an interconnected system. I think EBM is often mentioned maybe just now in the marine environment, but I think the really important part is how we connect everything.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Justin Langen. So I'm a graduate of the University of Manitoba. I'm a parliamentary intern in Canada. And yeah, I'm also an Indigenous activist. I work a lot with international entities and organizations. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Should I use? Yeah, okay. Abby Tingstad, U.S. Coast Guard Academy and RAND. And I would say more broadly, my research focuses in a couple of different areas. I do work on cooperation, especially in the Arctic region, on multiple levels and scales. I study organizations, and I also do research on developing scenarios using both quantitative and qualitative data, and then how to use those to think about the future directions of the Arctic.
Thank you so much. As you can tell, we have done a really good job at picking people for the panel. So kudos to the organizing committee for picking great people. They have different perspectives on EBM. They do different types of work. So I'm going to start off with a question, and I want you to think of your perspective and your work. This isn't a test or a right answer. So I want to ask you, from your perspective, what are the most critical challenges and opportunities in achieving cross-sector and cross-boundary collaboration when it comes to EBM in the Arctic? And this question is for all of you. Do we want to start with Abby, perhaps?
Oh no, start with the the person who doesn't actually study EBM, but thank you for letting me be on the panel anyway. Maybe that's why I'm here off here to the side. No, with all kidding aside, it's great to be thinking about this from different perspectives. I would say, based on my research on climate change, not just in the Arctic, but I do some work on analytic gaming and looking specifically at people's outlooks into the future through some of these games about climate change under different scenarios. And I think one thing that we miss a lot when we consider how to do planning of various forms, and it certainly applies in this context as well, is really what people are thinking about for the further future horizon. Because we have the situation that we're in today, and we often think about how were agreements or decisions made based on the world that people were living in at the time that the decision was being made. But really, when those people were making that decision, many of them were probably also, thinking about not just how I feel about things this year, but how might things look in 10, 20 years from now. So in the climate change research that I mentioned, it really is remarkable that, people, it's really less about how they're feeling about, the current year and the experience of climate change, though also important, but it's really about that trajectory that things are going. And so I think we have a real opportunity in EBM also to really think about kind of the different time horizons under which decisions are made, and that systems of decision making need to be durable under. And I will mention, going back to the excellent question that I received at the end of the talk that Amelia and I gave, one of, I think, based on this time horizon line of thinking, one real sticking point for Central Arctic Ocean negotiations right now is I have observed that some of the stakeholders, and I'll use that term carefully because it does have meaning, but imperfect as it is, I'll use it here. I think some stakeholders really would like to see or otherwise envision a fishery developing in the Central Arctic Ocean. And I think others really see it as something that should be largely a conservation area. And because of these two different perspectives on how the Central Arctic looks for the further future, negotiations on things like how do we define scientific fishing today become very, very difficult.
Thank you. Yara, do you like to speak?
So I think the challenge is also what makes the great possibilities and the pros on ecosystem-based management. As I've talked about, it craves a lot of knowledge to be able to successfully manage something in an ecosystem-based manner. You need different aspects, experts on different topics. And that can be a challenge to be able to know all these people, to be able to mitigate all these people, to bring all these different perspectives into something that's functional also for management. But that's also the positive thing, to be able to build these connections and sort of have these new interdisciplinary perspectives that help us move forward when it comes to management.
Definitely. Justin?
It's quite fascinating, the notion of collaboration. I had the opportunity to go to Davos last week, and the theme was collaboration in the intelligent age. And there was only 6 indigenous leaders there, with me being one of them. And it was a lot of discussion and talking about how man and nature have this inherent flawed relationship within the current systems of our society, and how do we correct that with AI, with intelligence, with technology. And that's all fine, but I think the focus all on this technology as the outcome rather than a tool to find an alternative or find a better option for society. So, when we talk about beyond borders or collaboration, I think that is much more of shows the power of collective and shows the power of connection and finding, diversity is a strength, not a weakness. And I think it's important that we, not just see, even the notion of stakeholders, that's something that's like, a necessity, right, in the current systems, even though we might not all agree with it. But, I think utilizing the systems and the frameworks that we have, while we know what needs to be done, I think it's important that we actively, take the approach and utilize our network that we have right now to do the things we need to do. And I think, I understand the bureaucracy of government, of funding, everything like that. And it's been a headache, and it's definitely something where there's such urgency in the world to fix and correct these problems. But we're in an age right now, in the intelligent age, where we can connect and communicate with so many different societies and communities that I think it's up to the individual person, that it's up to every one of us to ensure that we utilize our own, I guess, dignity and our own passion for creating a sustainable future in our own way. And I think whilst, navigating these systems that need to be better, while also remembering your humanity, remembering the dignity of indigenous peoples within these lands, and ensuring that there's a collaboration there. So I think that's where collaboration for me comes from. It's in ensuring the dignity and the humanity of all of us.
Excellent, thank you. Saskia?
Well, I think for me, maybe the biggest challenge that lies in EBM is how we move from science to decision making and to action. And I think we have a lot of knowledge already about the Arctic system. It's sure we can always produce more knowledge, and knowledge should be the basis of making decisions. But we need to understand, how do we make the decisions? And EBM is supposed to be this cross-sectoral management approach, but how do you decide between so many sectors, so many competing interests, between economic interests, conservation interests? And I think looking at the guidelines that have been produced by the Arctic Council, for instance, but also CBD and so on, there's a lot more focus on the natural science aspect of EBM, which is about how you define an ecosystem, how you measure it, how you make an assessment of the ecosystem. And then there's this one step, is and then you manage it. But I think we need to understand more of how we manage it, and I think there's not one approach to, there's not one size fits all solution to EBM. EBM's it's more a way to go than an end in itself, I guess. And I think that maybe the opportunity that lies in the Arctic is there are already approaches to EBM in place, different approaches about including indigenous people, having marine management plans, and so on. So I think there's things to learn on, but there needs to be more collaboration as well on this policy science level, to understand how can we mitigate these conflicts, what are the institutional mechanisms that are needed, do we need to have EBM legally anchored, does it need to be a policy system, do we need marine spatial planning? I think there's a lot of policy questions in there as well.
Excellent point. Øystein?
I would like to echo some of the things that Saskia mentioned. And April last year, we had a specific meeting here in Tromsø, focusing on ecosystem-based management and what is it, and it was a really great conference. What strokes me then was that the approaches that have been applied in Canada, USA, Norway, other countries that have implemented the ecosystem-based management, is that there are very similar. There are huge similarities. So the framework is there. So I agree that when you're looking for a changing Arctic, maybe you have first, or pretty sure we have the first ice-free Arctic. If you're not able to turn things around, we will have the first ice-free summer in a few years. And this will, of course, open up the area for new possible activities. So I agree that getting together and defining environmental goals, I think all the countries that have land areas that are bordering the Arctic have signed the Montreal Agreement, and they should be able to find and define some goals. I think we also have a lot of the monitoring that is needed to say something about the state of the system. Of course, we have to expand this as the area is changing, but agreeing on common goals in the Arctic, I think that would be a good place to start, and also start looking into agreeing on some common principles and some common goals, and also looking into objectives, and also how do we get there? How do we want to achieve and preserve the environmental state that we want for the Arctic? It's important.
Some very good points made. So I know we have some questions from the audience. You can start raising your hands, and then we will start with Dorothy.
Thank you so much for this session and to the panel. I'm Dorothy Dunkel. I work at Sintef Ocean in Bergen, and I'll put on my hat of chair of the Nordic Marine Think Tank and bring up something that Saskia was mentioning. How do we manage? And one thing that scares me is climate change really puts a lot of pressure on our institutions. And there's no better example of this than Northeast Atlantic mackerel, which since 2010 has been, per definition, scientifically overfished. And that's because the coastal states can't agree on how to split the one quota that ICES gives, the scientific quota for that. And it's highly, highly problematic. We've been putting a lot of focus for all the right reasons on Russia, but we can look at our Nordic cousins and say we haven't even agreed on how this is the most valuable stock, maybe both ecologically and economically for the Northeast Atlantic. So when we can't even agree on how to split up the stock because it's so much money involved, there's so much power, how do you think our institutions will be able to agree? And I love calamar, of course, it's fascinating institutionally, but climate change is happening so fast, we don't have time for consensus, and also experiences from calamar where you can have countries who just are there to break the consensus because they don't want the science or the assessment to go forward. So there's a lot of weak points in our institutions, and I think we need to think about that. And then I want to bring up BB&J and the High Seas Treaty, because and maybe Øystein, you can comment on that, because as I understand, 60 countries have to ratify it, 15 have, and the deadline is the UN Ocean Conference in June in Nice. So it would be great to get some comments on that.
Øystein, it sounds like that was for you.
I think I will restrict myself from going into the fisheries agreements. I am not familiar with those, and this is we should have had someone here from the Fisheries Directorate or the Ministry of Fisheries. I'm not aware of how these things are working. I don't know if anyone from the Institute of Marine Research have some comments to this or whatever, but. Yeah, I agree that it's important to reach consensus, and it's not a nice example of how something that should have been easy negotiable is difficult to reach an agreement on. But I'm sorry I can't bring any.
Is Norway going to ratify BB&J?
I don't know.
Does anyone else on the panel have a response to?
Yeah, I could say something. I don't know. I've had the opportunity to work with like government officials, like ministers, and then talking with a lot of people like in governmental power. The collective thought I got was a lot of the data needs to be dumbed down. Like a lot of this needs to have a core narrative to get through to governments, to get through to industries, because statistics and data, from a scientific perspective, is great. However, for elected leaders, for governmental leaders, and for everyone else to understand it, we have to dumb it down quite a bit and maybe structure it into a narrative that fits their approach. And I think that's even more, important now that a lot of states are becoming more nationalistic and isolationist. When we talk about collaboration, I think it's important to highlight and connect with them, not at a purely scientific level, but at a narrative and emotional level, and a level that they understand. So even though it might be below the standard within your industry, to actively engage with these leaders, you have to get down to their level, I think, yeah.
Good point. Anyone else like to comment on that? Or No, let's.
Maybe
Oh, yeah,
just very
Abby?
quickly, perhaps. I just think I appreciate the comment about institutions and maybe agreements having been constructed or built before climate change became what it is today. And I'm not really sure, I'll admit, of the solution for that, but I think kind of building on your point that the first thing that maybe we can do, there is a whole lot of information and data and knowledge out there. I don't know, for those of you who work with policymakers, you know that we might get asked frequently about, so what's the answer to this, or what do we know about that? And our answer is typically, well, we actually know a lot about that, and I'm not really sure where the disconnect is. But I think figuring out a way to kind of better communicate what we do already know would be at least a starting point to make that information, knowledge, and data more accessible, kind of following on what you said.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? Where did all the questions go? Yeah, there we go. You'll be getting a microphone.
Hi, I'm Margaret Williams with the Arctic Initiative at the Belfer Center at Harvard. I have a comment for Justin and then also a question for Øystein. And my comment is I appreciate your distinguishing that one needs to have to make distinctions when approaching the community approach. And I live in Alaska where the indigenous community is incredibly diverse. There's just not one monolithic group or one monolithic opinion. And one of the challenges, speaking of climate change, is one of the most powerful native corporations is native owned. And they're huge voices in promoting oil and gas development, the very source of many of the problems that are impacting coastal communities in Alaska. So it's a huge challenge because there isn't one opinion. But so I appreciate the youth leadership that you are developing to promote these principles. And my question for Øystein is, speaking of climate change, as you're identifying, or as you're doing your 4-year update on EBM and reviewing your plan, are you accommodating changes of species distributions as things are moving around as a result of climate change?
Yes, we are. And we are also doing, putting efforts into modeling studies so that we are modeling different emission scenarios and coupling that to ecosystem-based modeling so that we can show for the decision makers what are the foreseen consequences. And we see that there is quite huge differences if we are able to cut according to the Paris Agreement compared to as if we are not able to do that. So yeah, both doing assessment of what we are observing, but also doing modeling studies that are trying to foresee the development for key species in the different ecosystems. Because we have very different problems in the different areas. Since Norway have a long coast, we see that for the southern areas, the problem is that it's getting too warm for the species that are originally there. So we see a change in the community. Whereas in the north, you see that some species actually benefit from increased temperature and have an increased growth. And whereas the strictly Arctic species are struggling. So it's a way of adaptive management, I would say. Of course, there's a problem that you have this 4-year cycle and the scientific base has to be finished 1 year ahead of the plan itself. And sometimes you need to do some last-minute updates if you have new information coming in. But yeah, all in all, we are trying to update all the time and also identify new knowledge needs, knowledge gaps.
So have you changed any borders? Have you changed any boundaries of your protected areas?
Yeah, we are looking into it at least, and we see that some areas are becoming more important and some areas are becoming less important. So that's also that could also be the case.
Thank you. There was another question, a hand I saw in the back.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Mette Skarn-Mauritzen. I'm from Institute of Marine Research, and I'm also leading the other advisory group for the Norwegian cross-sector management plans, the monitoring group. And I think my question is maybe a little bit similar to Dorothy's comment that climate change is putting stress on our institutions, but maybe also putting more stress on the EBM processes. And I feel that even though we have maybe EBM frameworks and institutions in place, we have not really solved how to do EBM, as several of you have mentioned. And my experience from Norway is that there is kind of a disconnect of what we put into the management plan process in terms of knowledge and what comes out at the other end after he's been through the ministries and all the balancing between the different sector interests. And I think that balancing act will just become more and more difficult as climate change is proceeding. So I think there are huge challenges for us to work on. And then I was curious about something that you said, Øystein, because you mentioned that maybe some cross-Arctic principles, if I understood you correctly, cross-Arctic principles or cross-Arctic goals could kind of improve the processes, and maybe, in my mind, it would be looking for ways to kind of constrain the processes a bit more. But could you elaborate on what you were thinking about when you mentioned principles in
I was thinking about the process within the Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, for instance, that they are now, as I understand it, negotiating the sort of how to implement that and what's going into this treaty and what. And as I understand, they are trying to implement a lot of the ideas and the principles from ecosystem-based management in that treaty. And so I think that trying to get the involved countries to agree on what they want the Arctic to have as an environmental state would be an important thing to discuss and agree on.
Saskia, you had a comment.
Yeah, just to react on that about I think you also mentioned before the ecological objectives at the regional Arctic scale. And so going back to the topic of conservation as well, I think we have these quantitative targets. We have these CBD targets at a global level, and the Arctic Council has at least done a policy commitment to having a network of MPAs, but still that doesn't really tell where to place the MPAs, and that there needs to be more of a transboundary collaboration between the states to identify these sites where you might place an MPA so that they can actually be ecologically coherent and representative. And I think there's a study from WWF that has kind of used a pan-Arctic perspective to identify areas that might be at least of interest for conservation and that can inform the planning processes. And then obviously these strategic plans need to go through these national policy processes, and often, as you say, the result might be quite reduced from what you put in on the other end. But I think it's important to kind of regionalize the objectives that we have, because only quantitative objectives like 30 by 30 seems very vague, and I think we need a more strategic approach of how to get there.
Excellent. There is one question from the front, and that is going to be our last question.
Gunnar Sander from NIVA, Norwegian Institute for Water Research. Saskia mentioned the challenge of going from assessing the state of the ecosystem to management. And I think that is quite key. And if you compare the two models that I think, as far as I'm aware of, are the only ones working at the large marine ecosystem level, the EU's Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Norwegian model, they are very similar, but there are also very significant differences when it comes to making policy. And if you look at the Marine Strategy Framework Directive of the EU, It tells that the government should have explicit objectives and impact assessment that demonstrate that the measures in the plans contribute to achieve the objectives. They also have mandatory participation in the processes. This is quite different from the Norwegian tradition. The Norwegian tradition is that people can participate only on the scientific basis. It's very hard to participate in the government's planning of the measures. And then comes the question to Øystein, because the government neither wants to have advice on how to formulate measures. And they only ask for advice on the state of the ecosystem. At least that has been the tradition. So my question to Øystein goes, is there a more open door now from the ministries to ask for advice also on how to designate measures for how to manage the ecosystems? Or are they still only interested in the state of the ecosystem and close the doors and make a very vague policy which everybody can afterwards interpret the way they want?
Quick answer.
Quick answer is we have not been, the mandates for the advisory groups have not been adjusted, so that we are mainly reporting on the goals and also the efficiency of the objectives already set in place. I agree that it would have been perhaps, how should I put it? It would have been interesting to be able to give advice on objectives from the advisory groups. But as of now, we are not being tasked to do that. And that's why also it would have been nice to have someone from the ministries here, because it would have been interesting to hear their perspective on this, and also how negotiations and the decision process regarding new objectives, how these things are decided on a ministerial level is somewhat of a black box for us working on the level under, I would say. Yeah.
Excellent. So that means that we are at our time. I will give the panelists one last challenge or opportunity. Do you have a take-home message you want to give the audience, and can you do it in one sentence? One sentence only. Challenge and an opportunity, if you want it. Now's your chance. No. Well, I guess.
Challenge and opportunities?
Well, it's a challenge to you and an opportunity to you. If you want to leave us with one take-home message in one sentence.
Yeah, it's ecosystem-based management. It can be difficult, it can be painful, but the positive side of it is that you bring together all the people that share knowledge about the oceans, and you bring together information about the activities and how you can improve the environmental impact that the different sectors have, and that gives you a better perspective to do wise decisions on behalf of the oceans.
Thank you.
That's one take-home message.
I think mine is ecosystem-based management is not only about sustainable resource use, it's also about conservation. And if we want to achieve both of them, then they have to kind of like play at a leveling field also in terms of legal requirements, frameworks, policies, and so on.
Thank you.
Yeah, mine would just be like embrace opportunities like this to collaborate and think outside of your own box, and yeah, challenge yourself as well.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess I would just add that I think it was great to hear so much discussion today too about the multiple kind of pushes and pulls and drivers of change. So if we're thinking holistically, I think that's a good thing.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. I also would like to extend some gratitude to the audience. Thank you for engaging and asking questions and showing up to 2 sessions today. I hope you have learned a lot. I certainly have. Have a wonderful rest of your conference. Thank you.